So yes, two apologies at the beginning. The first is that, as you might guess, I'm going to be speaking in English, so I apologize for that. And the second apology is that this topic is not happy. It's not a happy story, so just bear with me. And there's moments of happiness, but it is an intense story. And then the third thing is that anything that's unclear as I'm reading this paper, we'll talk about it afterwards. So afterwards, if you have any questions at all, if something was unclear, either with the language or an idea or whatever, we'll just talk about it. So feel free to ask any questions you would like at the end. On June 28, 1966, a military junta led by General Juan Carlos Onganía overthrew the government of Argentina. In the subsequent cultural crackdown, an era of suspicion and paranoia engulfed Argentine society that would last throughout the 1970s, when a second, even more brutal regime assumed power. Argentine-American composer, woodwind instrumentalist, and architect Guillermo Gregorio remembers a particularly painful and poignant moment from the 1966 Onganía takeover that was later dubbed Noche de los Bastones Largos, or the Night of the Big Sticks. He said, quote, "When the first day of the military came, they went to the universities and made double lines of police with helmets and long sticks. And they made the professors, the chancellors, and all the students walk out through these two lines. As they went out, like robots, the police were hitting the heads and shoulders of the students with sticks. This was emblematic, of course, because they were literally hitting culture on the head." It was in the midst of this intense period of political and social tumult that the performance art collective I'm discussing today was formed. Called Movimiento Música Más, which can be translated as the movement of music plus or the more than music movement, this little-known intermediate performance ensemble created a number of works during the Onganía regime that engaged with public spaces and the citizenry of Buenos Aires, interjecting an artistic response to the rigid governmental control of these spaces and bodies. By bringing a number of their performances outside to reclaim the plazas and the streets in Buenos Aires, MMM attempted a subversive approach to political activism that was cloaked in seemingly bizarre, outlandish artistic activity that illustrates what I suggest is a camouflage of naivete, allowing the political criticism and activism of their art making to proceed largely unnoticed by the dictatorship because of, not in spite of, their pseudo-amateurish, idiosyncratic, and surrealist aesthetic. MMM is not present in the prevailing narratives of Argentine history, nor in those of 20th century experimentalism, but their activities shed light upon how creative individuals respond in extreme situations. In addition, a look at MMM's work allows us to explore some problems in the narratives of experimentalism and put forth another case study of what Brandon Joseph has called minor history in his work on canonically challenged intermediate artist Tony Conrad. Adapting Deleuze and Guattari's work on Kafka and minor literature, Joseph argues that the minor is not qualitatively or quantitatively inferior, but what is marked by an irreducible or uncontainable difference. It is not a subcategory or a subsystem in the conventional sense, but what Deleuze and Guattari call at one point an outsystem. So MMM's work, presented here as a Latin American outsystem, exists beyond the bounds of prevailing narratives of experimental music, but was also viewed in Argentine experimentalist circles at the time as an outlier on the lunatic fringe. Joseph expands on Deleuze and Guattari's application of the minor, discussing the previously under-researched work of Conrad as minor, not with regards to aesthetic value, but in its appearance in major history. Due to its uncategorizable difference and crossing of disciplinary bounds, Tony Conrad's work has been difficult to subsume into a major history. And I should note, and many of you probably know this, Tony Conrad passed away about a month ago, or 3 weeks ago. It was very, very recently. Conrad's work is in this aesthetic zone of indiscernibility that minor works inhabit. And Joseph argues that's the very reason that minor figures often appear from the point of view of major history to be an unruly and indistinct mob, or as misguided or underdeveloped practitioners. Indeed, MMM's troubled relationship to Buenos Aires' legitimate art worlds, as characterized by several participants, confirms this view. In classifying MMM's work as an out system, I'm proposing that they existed simultaneously within the intentional aesthetic internationalism and cosmopolitanism of late 1960s Buenos Aires, and also outside of both this national cultural scene and the experimentalism of European and North American actors like John Cage, Fluxus, and so on. The inside-outside dichotomy exists in part because their work and largely non-academic musical backgrounds did not interface well with the so-called mainstream avant-garde of Buenos Aires. In fact, they were largely marginalized and often perceived as charlatans by the Argentine cultural elite. This talk then takes as its subject the intermediate out system of MMM in Buenos Aires, the group's localization of experimentalist aesthetics under a dictatorial regime, and their interconnections to the cosmopolitan forms of these practices. I'll focus on two of MMM's many performance pieces. The first is Plaza para una siesta de domingo from 1970, in which the group held a well-publicized birdsong contest in a city plaza, while MMM performed in a large cage. And the 1971 Música para Colectivo Línea 7, or Music for Bus Line Number 7, composed by Norberto Chavarri, during which the group performed on a city bus, using the vehicle itself as an instrument. These two performances embody MMM's approach to experimentalism, a commitment to bringing art and people into public spaces during a time of rigid governmental control of those spaces and bodies, and an interest in the political symbolism generated by their actions. The primary ethnographic sources for this research are three former members of the group, including Guillermo Gregorio, who's a composer and performer who's been living in the States since the 1980s, and composer and performer Norberto Chavarri, who's in Argentina. Chavarri and Gregorio are two of the three founding members of the group. In addition, I've also spoken to composer, performer, and multimedia artist Ramiro Larraín, who remains in Argentina along with Chavarri, although both spent time living in Europe in the 1970s and 80s, initially to escape the dirty war of General Videla's regime, which seized power in 1976. So that's the next dictator after this one. I told you it wasn't a happy story. Because of a number of difficult issues surrounding the interpersonal dynamics of the group and Videla's later terrifying, even more terrifying military regime that scattered many of the members to the four winds, I have had difficulties locating more of the artists involved in the group who are willing to discuss the period. I'm particularly saddened by the fact that I have thus far been unable to locate any of the many female members of the group to share their story. As musicologist Eduardo Herrera has written, the claim at the Ditela Institute, CLAIM is the acronym for the Center for Advanced Musical Studies, or the Latin American Center for Advanced Musical Studies, was a center founded in 1962, and it was an important center for avant-garde music in Buenos Aires. Both CLAIM and MMM's activities, however, existed in the broader context of the very rich and cosmopolitan arts environment of 1960s Buenos Aires. Laura Podolsky and other scholars have noted that happenings and ambientaciones, or environments, were a popular performance trend in 1960s Argentine arts. Quote, blending the conventions of visual art with those of theater in such a way that spectators frequently became active participants in the production of the artwork. Happenings were mentioned frequently in the daily press, with John King noting that the term came to mean, quote, anything out of the ordinary, suspicious, and slightly scandalous. While this talk is mostly interested in how the political content of MMM's work interfaced with the broader culture and political moment it was created within, it is important to highlight Podolsky's point that, quote, conservative groups and the government alike took umbrage to the types of works produced by these groups as much for their, quote, affronts to traditional decorum and codes of social conduct as for their unsanctioned political expressions. So in fact, it's not just about politics, it's about basic social conventions and being polite, right? So a lot of this work was considered impolite and rude. regardless of the political content. On the surface, MMM's work is seemingly conceptually indebted to the activities of Fluxus and other 1960s art collectives in Europe and the United States. And while MMM were aware of these developments, they were creating domestically inspired aesthetic responses to these complex problems in Buenos Aires. So this local approach to art making transforms this cosmopolitan experimentalism into a localized practice and adds what ethnomusicologist Tomás Turino has called a local tint. Turino identifies this tint as marking a, quote, key moment in the development of a cosmopolitan site in the context of a localization that is then passed down, generating further creative reinventions of the cosmopolitan aesthetic. While this is not really the case in the bounded and marginalized history of MMM, Turino's term is still useful to describe MMM's localizing of cosmopolitan practices. Their dialogue with the cosmopolitan and the indigenous is difficult to parse from this temporal distance, but the group did quite intentionally attempt to frame their work as deeply connected to local culture and the complexities of contemporary Buenos Aires under dictatorial rule. As Ramiro Larraín put it, the group had a, quote, more introspective view of their work's relationship to the wider world by using indigenous Argentine instruments and engaging with contemporary politics, as opposed to many of their contemporaries' efforts that were more centered on placing their work in a more cosmopolitan conversation with the art worlds outside Argentina. So they weren't really trying to get gigs in Europe or to leave Argentina. They were trying to really focus on their audience and the people within, especially within Buenos Aires. So an important key to understanding their activities is housed in the personal histories of the group's membership, illustrating both the commonalities and the unique aspects of their backgrounds that ground their experiences with the group. These origin stories serve to illuminate the many threads that drew these individuals together to make the collective. The first one I'll talk about, Guillermo Gregorio, was one of the founding members and was born in Buenos Aires in 1941 to a middle-class traveling representative for a fabric company. He grew up during the peak of paradoxical labor hero Juan Perón's rule, and in the home he listened to European art music and Argentine folkloric music. After hearing a recording of Louis Armstrong when he was about 8 years old, Mr. Gregorio convinced his father to buy him a trumpet, which he soon found didn't suit him. This is kind of a happy moment. So the trumpet didn't suit him, but he fell in love with the clarinet playing of Armstrong's sideman, Johnny Dodds, and quickly made the shift to that instrument, later adding the alto and tenor saxophone. He was soon performing weekly in jam sessions and dance halls with a young group that called themselves the Hot Dogs Band. They played 1920s Chicago-style hot jazz because, as Gregorio has said, it was strangely fashionable in Buenos Aires at the time. And if you're interested about this aspect of the story, I have a whole article that's about just Guillermo Gregorio and his sort of jazz story and how he consumed American black music and performed American black music, and then he ends up traveling all over the world, and his style changes as he travels around, but his connection to the jazz tradition continues. So that's a separate story you can follow later. I'd be happy to share that with anyone who's interested. During this period, Gregorio also attended a series of seminars with Argentine modernist composer Alberto Ginastera and became interested in the graphic arts, enrolling in architecture school so he might make a living while feeding his new interests. In the seminars with Ginastera, he was taken by the music of Anton Weber, Borges, and the music concrète of Pierre Schaeffer. The visual art he gravitated towards included concrete artists like Moholy-Nagy, Van Doesburg, and Max Bill. As a result, his appetite for modernist art and music grew in tandem with his love for jazz. This is just a photograph of Van Doesburg's studio that was in a book that he had as a kid, and he singled this out when I interviewed him and said it was this image, not just of the art, but the whole studio that kind of realigned the way he aesthetically thought about things. His introduction to vanguard jazz occurred in 1961 when he met Alberto Salacia, an independently wealthy patron of the arts and a small-scale importer of foreign recordings. Through Selassie, Gregorio was exposed to Ornette Coleman and Eric Dolphy's work, but also enamored with the music of Cage, Feldman, Brown, and Lamont Young's 1960 text pieces, which greatly inspired him, particularly composition 1960 number 5, in which butterflies are released into a performance hall. Norberto Chavarri, another founding member of MMM, had a similarly middle-class childhood based in Buenos Aires, where he was born in 1940. He studied piano with Fedora Aberasturi, whom he says was, quote, not only my piano teacher, but a great trainer of artists. She introduced me to Zen Buddhism, Hinduism, esoteric techniques, Gurdjieff's music, and decisively influenced me to free my mind of cultural atavism, to induce me to abandon the piano and start a creative practice as a composer. He also had a nourishing relationship with Argentine avant-garde composer Juan Carlos Paz, who was somewhat forgotten at the time when Chavarri knew him, but whose work has seen a resurgence of interest lately. Chavarri's youth was also enriched by taking part in the city's cafe culture, especially at La Paz and Corrientes and Montevideo, where in the evening, writers, artists, philosophers, psychologists, and subversive activists gathered and discussed the revolution, the third world, Cortázar, the latest film by Ingmar Bergman or Fellini, Dada, surrealism, and all the subjects of progressive and forward-thinking people. Sorry, that's a quote from Chavarri. Indeed, Café La Paz, which opened its doors in 1944, was a center for a diverse range of artists and intellectuals, a place with a, quote, preponderance for the avant-garde left, but whose decline began with the last military government when many of its regulars were either exiled or disappeared for thinking differently. Quote. It has since been renovated and reopened, as you can see in this photo here. It was in this social and intellectual milieu that Chavarri met the young composer Roque de Pedro, and the two became close friends, drawing on their shared backgrounds as, quote, musicians with conservatory training, as teachers of young students, as writers of music criticism, and as participants in Buenos Aires' bohemian life. De Pedro, Chavarri, and Gregorio in particular attended many of the public programs at the Claim in the Vitella Institute. Despite the conflicts they perceived via Claim's overarching aesthetic and from some individuals involved in the program, the MMM members interviewed for this study acknowledged that their engagement with those programs was an important learning opportunity for them, and it did draw them together, in part due to their feelings of marginalization from the program. So by attending and feeling marginalized, that actually drew them together. But it also put them in touch with the wider world of experimentalism that they could then draw upon to put in their own work. So this is the Vitella Institute, and that's just a close-up of the sign. For Ramiro Larraín, born in May 1946 in Buenos Aires, but with family roots in Benito Juárez, a rural area in the southern portion of the province, music was always present in his life, though he did not begin to play an instrument until he was 19, when he took up the guitar and later the alto saxophone. He also remembers being deeply affected by the sounds he heard in his semi-rural upbringing, from guitars, singing, and whistling, to the sounds of animals and the wind rushing across the plains of the Pampas. Well, whistling his way through childhood, the guitar became his entree into the world of music. He took lessons from composer Rolando Mañanes, from whom he learned both rudiments and a more, quote, free and creative vision of music. Shortly thereafter, he met and began studying alto saxophone with saxophonist Jorge Anders, who had actually performed with Duke Ellington when he was on tour, and then later relocated to New York City. And this was a period during which Larraín became, quote, absolutely bored of what and how I should play music, resulting in him, quote, quitting the guitar and taking up the saxophone like a sign. Around this time, a copy of influential experimental Argentine author Julio Cortázar's El Persigador fell into his hands. After reading the novel about a troubled saxophonist in Paris and his interactions with a journalist named Bruno, Larraín, quote, threw himself on the saxophone like a starving castaway. Shortly thereafter, he began performing with the Free Ensemble, a free jazz quintet, and met experimental artist Elda Serrato and her partner, composer Luis Subishaga, who invited him to play with the Grupo Improvisación de La Plata, or the improvisation group of La Plata, organized by Subishaga and Jorge Blarduni and Enrique Gerardi, all of whom were students at Klein. Larraín, Count Serrato, Suichaga, Bladuni, and Gerardi amongst his teachers from this early period of his career, as well as Cordobés musician Oscar Bazán, who was an early experimentalist, whose work is also really fantastic. And also the influential, politically active mixed media artist, Leon Ferrari. So these details in the developmental period of these three I'm outlining here just to illustrate their cosmopolitan nature, the various interlocking networks to which they're connected, and their wide-ranging aesthetic influences, as these elements play important roles in their aims and direction. The quotidian cosmopolitanism that drew these artists together was one of affinity through a shared aesthetic and countercultural outlook. The transnational aesthetics the young artists were absorbing and sharing with one another would soon be reshaped into their own autochthonous expressions, drawn from this wide range of sources, with inspiration flowing from both within and outside of Argentina. The arts and music scene of 1960s Argentina was a complex period of almost obsessive aesthetic internationalization, in an ultimately failed attempt to bring Argentine arts to global attention. There was an enormous amount of institutional support for this internationalist project, which created its own problems as the relationship between artists and institutions eventually became untenable, in part because of the perceived imperialist nature of some of the funding sources, as art historian Andrea Junta has argued in depth. This tension generated by the 1960s internationalist project and its attempted institutionalization of the avant-garde is embodied in painter and sculptor Pablo Suarez's 1968 resignation letter, written in response to an invitation to present work at Itela, in which he wrote, quote, "I cannot accept an institute that represents cultural centralization, institutionalization, and that the institution only lets in products that are already prestigious, which it uses when either they are no longer applicable or they are beyond reproach. That is, it uses them without running any risk." End quote. Suarez continues his polemic, stating that the meaning of any topical work is nullified by its acceptance by institutions, and that artists, quote, "who want to be understood must either say it in the street or somewhere else where they will not be distorted." End quote. One of the primary benefactors of the internationalization project was the Ditela Institute, initially established by two young industrialist heirs interested in making Buenos Aires a center for artistic experimentation. In his important research on Klein, musicologist Eduardo Herrera has traced the support of this center not only to the Ditela brothers, but also to United States actors involved with cultural Cold War development policies aimed at Latin America. While Herrera has not found direct financial connections to claim from programs like U.S. President Kennedy's Alliance for Progress initiative, he does point out that, quote, "many of the individuals involved in the formulation of these policies and the general notions that they held were in contact and belonged to the same social networks as those in the philanthropic foundations that provided grants, such as those for the art centers at Ditela." And that in particular is, he's talking about the Rockefeller and Ford foundations, who did give money to Ditela. But the same people are involved in these circuits that were involved in the broader Cold War happenings. Herrera argues that it is, quote, "not just that these ideas were the backdrop for the birth of projects like Plan, but that the same groups of people acting in different structural positions also articulated the discourses of modernization in various sectors, many of which were open to them as a specific result of their economic capacity." The Music Center was just one of several art centers housed here in Ditela. The others focused on visual arts and theater. But it was an important site for the creation of work by Latin American composers who would later become well-known internationally. In addition, Ditela Institute sponsored residencies by international composers like Yanis Danakis, Aaron Copland, Olivier Messiaen, Earl Brown, and Luigi Nono, a group that MMM founder Norberto Chavarri sardonically calls, quote, "the grand maestros of Gatopardismo," which is a literary reference that, roughly translated, signifies on the idea that everything changes but nothing changes. Ditela was the site of the first meeting of these three artists who would form the group, form MMM, and became the ideological whipping post of the group, who somewhat disparagingly called them all the mainstream avant-garde. While a number of the artists at Ditela felt that MMM were not serious enough about their craft as artists, in part because of their use of non-musicians and the general public in a number of their works. It was a September 24th, 1969 performance by Larry Austin, an American composer, at Itela that brought together Guillermo Gregorio with Norberto Chavarri and Roque de Pedro. Following the concert, Gregorio struck up a conversation with Chavarri and de Pedro, and the three of them headed to a cafe for a heated discussion of aesthetics and politics, during which Gregorio remembers, quote, "They said they were planning a movement, not a group. We discussed that it would be music plus other things that were not exactly music." Chavarri's memories of the founding of MMM are slightly more impressionistic. He said, quote, "We did not feel affinity with those executive first-class musicians. With the electronic musings or the laboratory of Stockhausen, we were closer to Satie than Ravel, more vile than Weber. Now in the distance, I visualize the moment of awakening to my vocation as when atoms become unstable and are able to impregnate the sky, exploding with something unusual. One night I met two architects who participated in this atomic instability and who were also looking for something new and different to place their artistic concerns. These people had much to contribute in building our group. We discovered each other as cultural orphans, and they encouraged us to unite our skills." End quote. So what set MMM apart from their Argentine contemporaries was a committed focus to collective art making and an engagement with the general public that was active in nature and not a passive consumption model. Chavarri has noted the reasons for this experimentation as being that, quote, "We were people from lower middle class barrios in a little corner of South America. We had absolutely nothing to lose if we burned the ships of civilization with our incursions into the content of experimentation." It's like one of my favorite quotes of all time. Beautiful. In fact, one of the ways MMM felt they were marginalized by the mainstream avant-garde was that they were not part of the elite art worlds of Klein and Ditella. Chavarri's statement highlights the importance of class in MMM's critique of Klein, but also further explains MMM's inclusion of both autodidact and non-musicians in both their membership and their performances. The choice was intentional, and while their aesthetic orientation welcomed the stochastic chaos in their work that decision produced, it was also a class-based and politically minded commitment to their ideals, keeping in mind with MMM's hope of making, quote, something more than music. Regarding the larger historical backdrop of 1960s Argentine artists' incorporation of politics in their work, Andrea Giunta has described, quote, "a constant friction between the political and cultural spheres that led to a situation within which politics became unavoidable for artists, not only as a theme in their work, but also as a problem that had to be resolved with the creation of new art forms." MMM's first collective work was an event at the Opera Theater at the close of the International Congress of Architects in Buenos Aires in 1969, whose theme that year was architecture as a social factor. The piece had all the components of the MMM pieces that would follow. It was highly theatrical, provoking the public to interact and take part in the performance, whether they knew they were or not, and traditional concepts of music and musicality were not the primary concern of the work, but rather a byproduct of the social processes that they had set in motion with their activities. Chavarri recalls, El Tiempo y el Corro was our debut work. We entered the stage as members of a choir in concert dress and remained silent and still for a long time, projecting a hieratic attitude and looking at the public. This eventually made the audience upset and outraged by the unbearable silence that was occurring, and they began to insult and shout. The public ended up becoming the real choir, and we, the choir members standing on the stage, started clapping to unveil their role as the spectators. We managed to reverse the roles, a goal that was more outrageous than desired. Ramiro Larraín attended this first performance by MMM as an audience member, and struck by their work and aesthetic, cast in his lot with the budding collective. The confrontational and participatory nature of the piece charted a course for their future work, but also reflected the artistic milieu of this Argentine art scene at the time. In particular, this period, immediately after the groundbreaking Tucumán Arde, or Tucumán is Burning activities of 1968 in Buenos Aires and Rosario, which is another big city. That's actually the city I'm originally from, Rosario. Tucumán Arte was a situation in which a group of vanguard artists, including Leon Ferrari, who I mentioned earlier as one of Larraín's self-described mentors, they sought to break down the divide between art and everyday life, art and politics, but also to critique the internationalist project and oppose a major labor dispute that was happening in Tucumán. So all of this Tucumán artwork, this exhibit, came out of a labor dispute, a union, basically the government trying to break up the labor union in this area. It was very bloody and it was very terrible. And so these artists sort of made this statement. And you can see the banner here. So this is in the gallery. The gallery is like, visit Tucumán, the Garden of Misery. So it's like a tourism billboard that's making fun of this whole situation. So in developing this emerging revolutionary arts practice, many of the artists, quote, left the limits of institutional boundaries and took to the streets, which art historians Ana Langoni and Mariano Mestman point out, quote, entails the loss of the safety of a known environment to an unprotected, vulnerable space. You risk not only the artist's own body, but also the body of the work, which sometimes coincides with the body of the public, end quote. Langoni and Mestman also point out that in this violent and highly politicized period, the language of violence, perhaps unsurprisingly, was extremely prevalent in contemporaneous artists' writings. And they do a whole study about all these violent imagery and violent words that make their way into these artists' writings as they're talking about art, talking about blood and murder and all this kinds of this language that has been mapped onto art writings. So this transmutation of violence into both the aesthetics of the period and the broader collective unconsciousness of Argentine society is echoed in Sebastián Carasai's work, which presents compelling evidence of ubiquitous visual and linguistic metaphors of violence in Argentine mass media outlets during this period, including the use of the word liquidate in advertising from the period that slyly implied both the meaning of liquidate as a sale, selling everything, liquidating something, but also the meaning of assassination. And this is being used in advertising, mainstream advertising. Carasai also notes that in the early 1970s, the verb to kill became a positive superlative expression, especially for young people, synonymous with something great or spectacular, right? As well as the commonplace use of imagery of rifle scopes and circular targets that, quote, were also successful advertising strategies at the time and could be found anywhere from magazine covers to advertisements for industrial bearings. So it's within this charged environment that MMM took their work into the plazas and streets and the public transit systems of Buenos Aires in an attempt to engage the public directly with experimentalism that might puncture the illusory veil between the artists and their public. Beginning in roughly 1970, MMM began to create a series of collectively composed outdoor performance actions in the urban environment of Buenos Aires. Chavarri called these works pedestrian musics, which in Spanish is músicas peatonales, which is kind of a play on words because it's also pedestrian as people walking, but also pedestrian as, it's silly, it's something that's not great interest. But also tonales with tonal. So he's playing with words in this title, músicas peatonales. Again, as Chavarri outlines, these pedestrian musics were created, quote, in the social context of a city in conflict. Its inhabitants walked in silence with inexpressive looks of, don't mess with me. The pieces were intended to break this routine of urban mourning with the desire to shake the citizenry and observe their reactions. One composition from this series, which I mentioned before, Música para Colectivo número 7, which is music for bus line number 7, during which members of MMM boarded and performed on an unsuspecting public bus in regular service. Each musician took a position in the vehicle with sticks and played percussion according to a score designed to convert the movements of the vehicle into rhythmic patterns. In addition, the driver agreed to deliver a printed concert program to the passengers boarding. The driver could then also interact with the musicians by honking his horn at specific times. They also did a piece before this that's quite funny, where they were all standing on street corners, and they used passing cars as the score. And so specific cars would create specific sounds and how fast they were going and what color they were. And so the score actually is an interpretation of the cars going by. And then you have all the MMM folks standing on corners and playing this weird music. And there's no documentation of that piece. There's no photos or anything. So. Another piece from this series of works was entitled Plaza para una siesta de domingo, or the Plaza for a Sunday afternoon nap. Now this piece began with the idea of holding a birdsong contest in a public plaza. Since many people, I don't know if it's the case here, but in Argentina, especially in that period, owning a pet bird was sort of a status symbol. It was also something that just many people did because it was easier to have a pet bird than some other pet in the city. And this gradually expanded into a multi-movement performance piece. Announced in the mainstream newspaper Clarín, the announcement for the quote, first national birdsong contest trumpeted that, quote, birds of all races can participate, and that the songs would be judged by a panel of composers. The citizens who wanted their birds to compete in the contest were to visit an MMM office between specific hours of the day to enter their feathered friends in the event. So they even added a layer of fake bureaucracy to this birdsong contest to sort of comment on this situation, the dictatorial government that they were dealing with. The performance took place on Sunday, November 8th, 1970 at 3 p.m. in the centrally located Plaza Rubén Darío, in the middle of what would normally be siesta, or nap time, when many stores close before reopening again in the evening and people stay home or go for walks, typically after enjoying a nice big lunch. The work began with a series of conga lines starting from the peripheries of the plaza, led by members of MMM, followed by children and unsuspecting passers-by who were handed small sound-making children's toys like clickers and kazoos, and who then processed toward the center of the plaza, where a large cage was constructed with Chavarri and other MMM members inside, conducting simple rhythmic and melodic patterns for the musicians and participating public. Throughout this procession, the contestants in the birdsong contest, both feathered and not, had begun gathering throughout the plaza, adding their own chirping din to the lines of MMM Pied Pipers. The birdsong contest was held after everyone had gone to the central location around the cage, and Gregorio and Chavarri clearly recall the sounds of dozens of singing birds mixed with the laughter of children. And I have to say, I'm loving the sound of the birds coming down the stairs. So following the mock birdsong contest, or perhaps during it, the members of MMM that had led the groups through the plaza the rest of them entered the large cage and began playing simple melodic fragments that the public outside were meant to spread across the plaza with the kazoos and the other instruments they had handed out. Gradually, MMM wound down the performance after going into a kind of an open improvisation together. And you can see all these various instruments involved. They wound that down, and children were then allowed to use the giant cage as a jungle gym. The saxophonist there is Guillermo Gregorio. Just curious. And so with the children climbing on the cage, that became the sort of end of the piece. So in his 1968 essay, Art and Social Commitment, Argentine poet Ricardo Carrera asks, quote, what kind of art should we be making? He suggests that, quote, the more massive and quotidian, the better. Quotidian like my shoes, but as though one of them was much too big and the other much too small. End quote. Carrera suggests that in order for a work to exude a social and political engagement, it must simultaneously feel like an essential part of the everyday and yet somehow also be remarkable and surprising, different from normal expectations. So how might we evaluate the lasting political and social import of MMM's work? And how was MMM able to manifest such seemingly overtly political projects during a dictatorial regime? What I'm suggesting is that MMM's activities, which were largely marginalized by Buenos Aires' artistic institutions and institutionally affiliated artists, were also subversively hidden by this camouflage of naivete, resulting from exactly the perception of amateurism ascribed to their work by more mainstream avant-artists and many of the official arts institutions. While their work flew in the face of traditional good taste and was sometimes deemed outrageous in the press, I argue that it is perhaps because their work was seen as not serious that its political content may have been greeted with indifference by the dictatorship. That said, what political content exists in these two works that we've looked at? In the case of the Plaza piece, the performance took place free of charge in the plaza, public plaza on a Sunday during siesta, when in theory anyone could attend, with the goal of bringing these people from the city into these controlled spaces to work together as a creative body, which in itself under the regime is considered a political action. There's also the piece's attempt to manifest Chavari's hope of breaking the routine and shaking up the citizenry, whom he viewed as part of the apolitical and apathetic Argentine silent majority. The birdsong contest was announced as being open to birds of all races, as I mentioned before, a symbolic gesture of universalism. In addition, the line between audience and performer was blurred, as in many of their works, with anyone being able to contribute to the event. Perhaps most noteworthy is, of course, the presence of the cages, both those of the bird contestants and the giant cage that the group performed within. Gregorio has stated that the cages were overtly meant as allegories for the political situation at the time and the tight control of both personal and public space, and that it was this that they hoped to counteract in this piece. Now, to return briefly to the constructed ideological division between MMM and the so-called mainstream avant-garde, one interesting yet contradictory issue is that many of these MMM events were sponsored by municipalities or arts organizations. So how might we reconcile what seems to simply be a case of trading one form of institutional support for another? There is the important difference that the Ditela Institute and Claim was funded by foreign entities in part, and that the MMM performances were all facilitated by local organizations, but neither were truly countercultural in the popular use of the term, because they are engaging with governmental institutions. In addition, because Chavarri and De Pedro's slightly more traditional pedigree, they were able to, when needed, activate their network of contacts in the so-called legitimate music world to secure venues or other resources. Feeling that MMM were playing both sides of this ideological field, on the one hand staging political performances as a marginalized artistic counterculture, and on the other hand being able to mobilize fairly mainstream support networks, this became an issue and caused Gregorio around 1973 to abandon his work with MMM, as he went through a very personal political crisis. He said, quote, "It was around the time of the return of Perón. I thought it was a moment of political responsibility, and that I had to put my work in function with that. I got the feeling that Norberto and Roque didn't want to make anything explicitly political, so I started considering that we were playing a game that was not in accordance with the social and political responsibility of the moment, and that it required a certain kind of engagement." Larraín had a similar experience to Gregorio, stating that the dictatorship and the subsequent appearance of Perón put me in a very bad state, and suddenly I felt I could not be an artist. I had to stop all my activities and just work in an obsessive way. I got seriously angry when someone called me an artist. This state lasted a long time and cost a lot of therapy for me to get back to work. I remain a political artist. In those early years of my return, we worked on the memory of the dictatorship with the motto "Memory and Justice" as a guide, both for the cases of disappearance and for the damages that this caused to the workers of the country. For Chavarri, his involvement with MMM continued a few years longer, until 1975, though he feels similarly that MMM had, quote, failed to reach all its objectives. The dream of creating a community of creative amateurs didn't solidify. We did, however, produce a vibrant effervescence and intensify the fires of our interior freedom. I still receive messages from people thanking me for the influence MMM had on their lives, though it nearly cost me my home. As Chavarri hauntingly describes it, violence and intolerance have been present throughout my musical life. Before, during, and after Onganía, with governments that were democratic or military, death came from both the left and the right. Art was our exit door from the shadowy world that plagued us. The stories of MMM survivors suggest that the deep and continuing problems of art making in Argentina are not simply delimited by what we as onlookers might call times of turmoil, such as those of the Onganía regime, but are wounds that in fact continue to injure for years beyond the initial trauma. So in conclusion, One of the most obvious issues with the prevailing narratives of musical experimentalism is the still limited but steadily diversifying geographic purview of scholarship in the field. As scholars continue to push outward from studies of canonical locations like Western Europe and the United States, and in particular New York City, we have an opportunity to learn from these so-called peripheral or minor forms of experimentalism, and a responsibility to incorporate their unique expressions into a more globally representative historical narrative. For example, Egyptian composer Halim El-Dab, he made a 1944 wire recorder piece at exactly the same time. It was made in Radio Cairo, just as Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre-Henri began exploring the possibilities of multiple turntables and concrete sounds in France. So should facts like these affect the prevailing narrative of electronic music history, or should they remain as footnotes or as historical curios? There's certainly a growing number of scholars reconsidering the great stories of musical experimentalism. And I'm thinking of people like George Lewis, Ben Pickett, and David Novak, which along with this case study are interventions for further exploration and critical revision of the major histories. That said, it should be noted that simple inclusion is not the goal of minor histories, nor are they meant to displace major histories. In fact, Brandon Joseph has argued that minor histories are not isolated developments nor self-contained movements unto themselves, but are in fact dependent upon their contentious relationship to major histories for their importance. So in fact, it's that tense relationship between the major and the minor that makes the minor actually important. Joseph goes on to say, quote, "If minor artists retain a place within major history, it is only on account of their relation of proximity to the movements and categories engendered by major history, and because of the unceasing pressure that they exert upon them." In the case of MMM, what mark is made on major histories when a group of largely self-taught, sometimes intentionally amateurish artists, inspired in part by Fluxus, carry that cosmopolitan inspiration to very different ends, giving it a local tint born from the intense political strife of Argentina? How should the difficult and perilous political backdrop of the military regime affect our interpretation of these creative works and the people who make them, as opposed to similar activities happening in democracies with protected free speech? In addition, what we learned by examining MMM is something about how and what cultures remember. As eminent anthropologist Clifford Geertz once wrote, "Culture is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves." In this case, the prevailing stories told about this era of Argentine culture do not center on stories like that of MMM, or even stories of Klein, the Ditela Institute. Carasai, in his work on Argentina's middle-class silent majority of the 70s, concluded that although the protagonists in major histories of the period no doubt, quote, occupied the center of the political stage, he says there were also countless anonymous stories unfolding in the background, playing less of a leading role but still influencing and at the same time suffering the influence of the course that the events took. These actors, Carasai states, quote, may not have been the protagonists of history, but they were no mere spectators. Indeed, MMM were no mere spectators and also demanded that their audiences step out of the anonymous comfort of observer and take an active role in their art actions, creating temporary aesthetic communities of the body politic that for a moment reimagined normative behavior in the public spaces of a city under the pall of a dictatorship as something audaciously incantatory and revelatory. Their art was carried out in the quotidian streets of Buenos Aires, but posited a reimagined alternative surreal world like the one poet Carrera described, with one shoe much too big and the other much too small. MMM in many ways fulfilled philosopher Jacques Rancier's definition of political activity in the arts as, quote, reconfiguring the distribution of the perceptible, introducing new objects and subjects onto the common stage, making visible what was invisible, and making audible as speaking beings those who were previously heard only as noisy animals. If, as Rancière has described, political activity is, quote, a conflict aimed at deciding what is speech or mere growl, the artists of Movimiento Música Más have spoken boldly and clearly.